before we talk about hypoxia, let's talk about, because we know what hypoxia means, right? Decreased oxygen delivery to tissues. Before we talk about this in more details, I want to hear your opinion, right, about hypoxia. Or let's talk about normal oxygen delivery. So, Blessing, okay, how many systems in the body, how many organ systems in the body do you think it takes to get oxygen to the tissues? So when we get oxygen from the atmosphere to the tissues, how many systems in the body do you think will take to do that? How many systems will play a role in getting oxygen from the atmosphere to the tissue?
A lot.
Yeah, so be specific. Which systems definitely will be critical for that?
I mean, respiratory system is the
Respiratory system will be involved. Okay, what else? Remember, we're getting from going from atmosphere to the tissue. Any tissue you can think of, maybe the kidneys, the GIT. How will I get the oxygen from the atmosphere? How will I get it all the way to that tissue? So respiratory will be involved, yes. Any other system?
Maybe CVS2.
Cardiovascular will be involved. Yeah. Any other system?
I think the kidneys also play a small role, I think.
Okay. Kidneys might play a role. Yeah. Yeah. Any other system? What do the vessels contain? What's the content of the vessels? Blood, right?
Oh, blood. Oh,
right.
okay.
So hematology, another system.
Oh, yeah.
Blood, and in the blood, which to be specific, what in the blood will play a role for sure in oxygen delivery? RBC, yes.
Okay.
And then water itself, plasma, which is what, because some of the oxygen will be carried, right? Bound to RBC, some of them will be what, dissolved. Do we agree? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm thinking about oxygen delivery. If you're telling me, right, the oxygen delivery is the respiratory system, you're already going wrong. And this is what your exam does. So you have to be able to think multi-system at this level to succeed on step one or even succeed later in medicine. You have to be able to go across multiple systems. You cannot just stay in one system. The respiratory system plays a role, fine, but that's not the only thing we need to deliver oxygen. I also need cardiovascular system. I need the kidneys somehow to probably play a role as well. The blood, for sure. Red blood cell plasma is, yeah, play a role. If we want to place order of involvement, can we predict the order of involvement to this system? Ross, let's give it a try. Let's say we want to place the order of involvement. So we're starting from the atmosphere, right? Oxygen in the atmosphere. I want to see in what order will these systems get involved in getting oxygen from the atmosphere to the tissue. What do you think the order would be? The system will be involved first, second, third, fourth. Ross. Ross, are you there? Okay, Shani, you wanna try? What will be the order of involvement?
Doc,
Okay, go ahead.
okay. Doc, I'm thinking, maybe cardiovascular first, because we have to.
Think about it first. Where are you starting from? Where's the oxygen? Where are we bringing it in from? Where's the oxygen first?
Oh,
The oxygen is where?
in the atmosphere.
In the
Right.
atmosphere, right? So what system will involve first?
Cardiorespiratory system.
Respiratory should be the first that will be involved, right? What system will be involved second?
Okay, so well, cardiovascular.
Cardiovascular, most likely. What system will be involved third?
Blood.
Blood. Okay, then maybe kidneys might play a role. I'm going to tell you where kidney comes in. It's not that might not be obvious yet. But remember, red blood cell EP, right? Kidneys and stuff. Okay, so, but definitely 1, 2, 3. Respiratory, cardiovascular, blood. Okay, good. All right, let's take them one by one. We're just talking here. I want to figure it out. Create a story. So we already talked about respiratory, right? So we're not going to talk about that more. I mean, we talked about respiratory since yesterday. So by now, I expect everybody to kind of understand how respiratory, right, plays a role in getting oxygen from the atmosphere to the tissue. Let me recap. We need ventilation, get the oxygen to the lungs, into the alveoli. How do we do that? Pressure gradient, right? Get oxygen in, and then if we get the oxygen in now, we need to figure out how it's going to make it to the cardiovascular system, right? Something like that, and then the blood. So, Shani, what do you think? Let's be a little bit more specific. Let's see. We get oxygen into the alveoli. What do you think is the link? What will be the link between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system? In this case, what will be the link? Where are they linked? Where will be the interface between them?
The cardiovascular system would be important because it will bring the oxygen and nutrients and all those things to the cells in your body. It'll take away like carbon dioxide and waste products.
Okay, so you're right. You mentioned cardiovascular is important because first of all, cardiovascular system does what circulate blood, right? Throughout the body, it circulates nutrients. Get nutrients to the tissue, fine. Get the waste product to the lungs, to the kidneys, to the sequestration. All right, so perfusion, right, is the link, like you said. So if I'm here in the respiratory system in green, the link with the cardiovascular will be what? Perfusion. So we already know what does the kidney, what does the lungs do? Ventilation. Get air in. Cardiovascular will do what? Perfuse the ventilated alveoli. Perfusion. P. That's where cardiovascular comes in. The heart is not pumping, right? We can't get blood flow there. If the vessels are not there in the lung, they are occluded, maybe P, whatever, flow will be disrupted. So V, respiratory, Q, perfusion, right? Cardiovascular. Okay. How will you get, do I need, right? What will I need to get oxygen from here to the perfused to the blood? We need, go ahead. Go ahead. You said?
Capillaries need like a diffusion barrier to like carry it down
Nice.
to the
Now,
vessel.
good. Now we're talking. So we need, first of all, what do you need first? You need what? You need a gradient because this is passive, right? Process. Passive diffusion. Oxygen can, it is lipid soluble. So it can easily go, right? Oxygen is lipid soluble. It can easily go from the respiratory system into the, right, blood. So we need a pressure gradient or concentration gradient. So let's say concentration, right? Gradient. And what will create this gradient? Because oxygen is a gas, right? So my alveolar partial pressure of oxygen minus arterial partial pressure of oxygen, right, will create the gradient that I need. My alveolar pressure of oxygen, how much oxygen is in the alveoli, right? The difference between that and the oxygen dissolved partial pressure of oxygen, the gaseous form of oxygen in the arterial end will create the gradient that will drive oxygen right from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. So that's gradient. I need that. What else do I need? I need what? I need the intact diffusion barrier, right? And diffusion barrier is it depends on factors like the surface area. So SA will be the surface area of the barrier itself. How much total surfaces are available for oxygen to diffuse through SA, surface area, and then the thickness of the barrier. If I have enough surfaces, how much distance, thickness of the barrier or distance, the oxygen has to travel through from the alveolar end, right, to the vascular end or the capillaries. So to get oxygen from the alveolar end to the capillary end, I need what? To create a gradient. Then the barrier is important. What is the SA, surface area of the barrier? How much barrier is available? Surface is available. Then the distance, how thick is the barrier? As you can see here, the thickness of the barrier is inversely proportional to diffusion. The longer the distance the oxygen has to travel, or the thickness, the slower the diffusion. Then the gradients too. If I have high gradient, more diffusion. Low gradient, less. Surface area, more surface area, which makes sense. More diffusion, lesser, right? Lesser diffusion. Okay. Before we move on from this, right, let me just add some things here. So remember, we know this guy, we can predict what will affect this guy, right? Capital A, O2. I mean, partial pressure at the atmosphere itself. Yeah, I need ventilation to be intact. I need partial pressure of the atmosphere get, create enough pressure gradient to get oxygen in. I need my respiratory system to be intact. My ventilation has to be perfect. My airway, right? They have to be open, right? And patent. I need to be able to create what negative nitrotic pressure. So basically, this capital AO2 depends on what overall function of the respiratory system, and the overall breathing mechanics must be intact. My ventilation must be intact. So I'm looking at my FiO2, I'm looking at my atmospheric pressure, my airways have to be open and intact. I'm looking at my tidal volume, I'm looking at respiratory rate, right? Overall ventilation. This will affect our capital AO2, how much oxygen I have in the alveoli. Super important. Okay, then we have for the barrier, division barrier, starting from the lung here, we have what our type 1 pneumocyte, which are simple, right? Simple cuboidal, yeah, epithelium, type 1 pneumocyte. And you're gonna have like interstitium here, basically outside the alveoli, outside the vessel, and then we have what our capillary endothelial cells. So those who form the barrier. So these are thin, also simple, right? Simple columnar. So this is a thin barrier, not that thick. Good. We love that, right? That's good. Okay. So I get oxygen from here, and you remember the blood itself coming in as oxygen, but the oxygen won't be that high. It's going to be PaO2. It's not going to be that high, at least initially. So I have enough gradient initially for oxygen to move out, and then by the time as oxygen is moving out from here, initially I have a low PaO2 here, I have a high capital AO2 here. Remember, capital AO2 will not really change. So let's say that one remains constant, doesn't change, capital AO2. Right. But then PaO2 will start progressively getting higher and higher, right? So by the time I get to this end of the capillary, right, my PaO2 should be what? Equal to capital O2. And what happens? My diffusion stops. Once I don't have a gradient anymore, diffusion stops, and yeah, we take the oxygenated blood away, right, back to the heart, we pump it out of throughout the body. So this is important. Right? So respiratory, cardiovascular, what's the link? Here's the link. Ventilation, respiratory, perfusion, cardiovascular, right? We need continuous flow of blood to maintain what? Concentration gradient that will allow, as well as ventilation, that will allow the movement of oxygen from the alveoli into the water, into the blood, right? Through a thin barrier. Okay. Where does blood come in? So blood already came in, right, a little bit here, because PaO2 is dissolved oxygen. That's the gaseous oxygen, right, in the blood, PaO2. But some of this PaO2 will now what? They're also going to be loaded onto what? Hemoglobin, and will form what? Oxidized or oxyhemoglobin. So, which is in red blood cells, right? Red blood cells come in through hemoglobin. So I get oxygen from the atmosphere into the lung. I create my gradient. I get oxygen into the vessels. In the vessels, oxygen will dissolve first. And then dissolved oxygen will create what? Enough pressure, right, to load some of the oxygen on what? Hemoglobin, basically. So oxygen is in the blood. What do we do next? How do we get to the we're still going to what? The tissue, right? So our tissues are here below. Tissue, any tissue you can think of. So let's see how these guys are connected. Capillaries at the tissue level. Right. So left heart, we get this oxygen to the left heart. Left heart pumps the blood, right? Which contains dissolved oxygen and oxidized hemoglobin, right? Or oxygenated hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin. We get it all the way, right? Through red blood cells carrying the oxyhemoglobin. The PO2 is dissolved in plasma itself. We get them right here. When you get to the tissue level, oxygen, hemoglobin releases oxygen right to the tissue easily, right? Depending on some factors. PaO2 too, right? So the dissolved oxygen will follow what? The blood that will be the water that will be filtered, right? The capillary level, right? And also going to get here to the tissue. So you get oxygen there, and then the blood picks up what? CO2, the waste product, in the form of bicarb, in the form of carboxyhemoglobin, and in the form of hydrogen ion as well. Yeah, back to the what? Here. And then you get rid of this CO2, you pick up oxygen again, and the cycle continues, right? So respiratory, cardiovascular, and then blood. That's how we get oxygen to the tissue, for sure. The only connection here from the blood to the kidneys will be what? EP, right? Yeah. I'm going to talk about how when that comes in or when it's important. But just understand this normal basic principle first, right? Makes sense. We can build on this. So everything we just talked about now, if I want to represent this in a formula, right? Look at this formula here. That is looking at all the factors I've just talked about right now. There's nothing new here, right? That determines what? Oxygen delivery. We have oxygen delivery depends on what? Depends on CO. That's cardiac output. That's the cardiovascular part, right? Flow, blood flow. So basically, how much oxygen I deliver to the tissue depends on what? The flow of blood to the tissue and how much oxygen the blood contains. Right, that will determine, right, my oxygen delivery. So cardiac Q, which is flow, is cardiac output. So the heart has to be working. My vessels have to be patent to get flow to the tissue. That's my cardiovascular, right? CVS here. Then blood. That's the content, arterial oxygen content, the blood. So the blood, we said oxygen is the word, is in two forms in the blood. It's in the word bound form. So how much hemoglobin I have, how much of the hemoglobin I have is saturated with oxygen, right? Because remember, hemoglobin has like 4 binding sites for oxygen. So are they all saturated or just 50% saturation or something like that? Yeah. So how much hemoglobin I have? If I have hemoglobin, how much of the oxygen binding sites are what? Right, saturated. Saturation. And then also what? The dissolved oxygen as well. This will determine the total content oxygen content, right, in the blood. Remember the sequence of events, and please, this is important. Respiratory, then cardiovascular, right? Blood comes in through the vessels and the heart pumping and all that. And then we have dissolved oxygen first, PO2. It is PaO2 that will do what? That will load. This is important first. This must be built. The pressure built by PaO2, right, what will load oxygen, right, into what? Onto hemoglobin and determine what hemoglobin saturation. That's important. So hemoglobin saturation doesn't affect PO2, but PO2 can affect hemoglobin, right, saturation. Yeah. Respiratory. Then what will affect PO2 is the respiratory system and perfusion, right? What will affect how much oxygen I have dissolved here is how much oxygen comes in from the atmosphere, how much oxygen was able to diffuse from the atmosphere, right, into. Then perfusion. Even if I have oxygen coming to the lungs, I have good barrier, but there's no blood flow. Something is wrong with the flow. The vessels are obstructed with pulmonary embolism, for instance. What happens to my PO2? It's going to be low, right? As well. So it's super important. So these, you can see this is the respiratory, the blood flowing coming in, the diffusion barrier, right, affects what? PO2, determine PO2, small AO2. Then small AO2 will what? Will load oxygen, right, onto hemoglobin. So that will determine the oxygen hemoglobin saturation in that order. Yeah. If the problem is here, what does this mean? If the problem is here, that means I don't want to write too much here. Okay, let's put it here. Let's put it here, be organized. So we're looking at PO2 affected by what? Or determined by respiratory through my P capital AO2, oxygen that I bring in. I will know what will determine P capital AO2. Then the blood flow, perfusion, will come in, and then the diffusion barrier. Diffusion barrier, right? This will affect this guy. Then this hemoglobin saturation affected by what? PaO2, right? Then capital AO2 is affected by what? Remember, atmosphere, like altitude and stuff. How much oxygen I have in the air I'm breathing in, FiO2. My respiratory system itself, my ventilation, tidal volume, respiratory rate, yeah? Movement of air in and out. The airways will affect what? P capital AO2. Yeah. So if the problem is here, everything will be affected. Yeah. If the problem starts here, my capital AO2 will be fine, right? But small AO2 hemoglobin, oxygenated hemoglobin will be affected. If the problem was at the level of hemoglobin, then only hemoglobin will be affected. My small AO2, PaO2 will not be affected. So I don't know if that makes sense. So this is important, right? Just to follow the trend, right? What do you expect to see on the labs? You can predict, right, based on the pathology. Yeah. So capital AO2 affects what? This guy, small AO2. And small AO2 is the one that affects what? This guy. So pathology starting from here, point 1 will affect all of them. Small AO2, hemoglobin saturation. Pathology starting from point 2 will spec small AO2. So my available oxygen will be normal, but my arterial oxygen will be what? Decreased, and then hemoglobin oxygen will be decreased. Pathology affecting the blood, level of the blood, hemoglobin saturation, hemoglobin levels, concentration. Hemoglobin will be affected, but my dissolved oxygen and available oxygen will be normal. Guys, are you with me so far? Make sense?
To clarify, you're saying if the alveolar oxygen is affected, which is number one here, then it would also affect small AO2.
Yes.
And if small AO2 is affected, which is number 2, it would affect the hemoglobin.
Yes.
And if the hemoglobin is affected, it would not affect anything else.
Right. You see the direction of the arrow. Where's the initial event? If the initial event here is at capital AO2, everything downstream will be affected as well. 1, 2, 3. If the starts at 2, will 1 be affected? No, because the problem starts at 2, not at 1. So 1 is spared, 2 will be affected, 3 will be affected. If the start at 3, 1 and 2 will be spared. So it's a downstream effect or domino effect. If the parent start at 1, everything below that will be affected. If the parent start at 2, everything before 2 will be spared, 2 and 3 will be affected. If the parent start at 3, only 3 will be affected, 1 and 2 will not be affected. They are above that. Makes sense?
Yes.
Right. Remember our order of involvement. That's why I went to that order. Respiratory, cardiovascular, blood. So respiratory affects what? Cardiovascular and blood somehow in that order. Something's wrong with the respiratory system, which is where capital AO2 is. Everything downstream will be affected as well. Cardiovascular, which is PaO2 and blood. PaO2 hemoglobin. Yeah. If the problem is at the level of the cardiovascular system instead, or the interface between the respiratory and cardiovascular system, so the diffusion barrier, the perfusion, right, the PaO2 and all that, my capital AO2 will not be affected, but the small AO2 will be affected, right? And then hemoglobin, cardiovascular blood. When it's the level of the blood, just hemoglobin or whatever, yeah, then cardiovascular will not be affected, at least not like low, capital AO2 will not be affected. But I'm going to tell you how they're going to be affected. Like, I mean, they will not be affected, they will not be abnormal, right? Instead, but they're going to be affected as a compensation, yes, but not abnormal. So if hemoglobin is saturation is low, let's say somebody has a carbon monoxide poisoning, hemoglobin saturation is low, right? My capital small AO2 and capital AO2 will not be affected, but they can compensate. They will not be low, but they can be high to compensate, right, for the hypoxia due to low saturation. If somebody has low small AO2, right, low small AO2 from maybe high altitude, for instance, or diffusion impairment, emphysema, anything like of pulmonary fibrosis, what will happen to hemoglobin? Hemoglobin will saturation will actually be low. It's going to be low, but however, you're guys also going to see what compensatory what polycythemia. Hemoglobin saturation will be low, but hemoglobin concentration might be high to compensate. Yeah, for that. So if one system is down, downstream, everything will be abnormal as well. If one system is down somewhere, you may also see what compensation by the other system, right, in the opposite direction, if they are not downstream, right, of that pathology, right, something like that. So we're going to see examples, but this is how you're going to be thinking about it, right? AO2, small AO2, hemoglobin, yeah, in that order. So whatever the problem is, just ask them what level is the pathology. You know everything below that will be affected, right? But then if the pathology is somewhere lower, 2, 3, the other one can compensate, right? For that, the one above may compensate. How will one test we use, right, to also kind of help us determine what level, right, the problem is going to be. Remember the AA gradient? So this concept of AA gradient, yeah, is based on this. It helps to determine what level the pathology is. Let's say I check the difference between the PaO2, P capital AO2, and small capital AO2. And the difference is normal. So patient is definitely, they have a pathology. They have hypoxia, they are hypoxia. And actually hypoxemia, low, so let me see, hypoxia is low oxygen delivery. There's a difference, right? Hypoxemia is what? Is hypoxia due to low PaO2. This is hypoxemia. Low PaO2 is hypoxemia. Hypoxia is just low oxygen delivery, which can be due to a lot of things, including what? Hypoxemia, right? So different terminologies, right? Different things. If a patient has, we're going to see later, if a patient has hypoxemia, so the pathology starts here. Patient has hypoxemic hypoxia. They're hypoxic because the population starts at 2. Capital small AO2 is low. I can determine, right? Somebody has small AO2, low small AO2 here at 2. There are two reasons why small AO2 will be low. It's either the problem is at 2 itself, so the pathology is at low at 2, or the pathology is at 1. Yeah, somebody has small AO2. Either the problem is at 1 and then 1 is affecting 2, or the patient has problem primarily at 2 and there's nothing wrong, right? With 1. That would be the 2 explanation, right? For low PaO2. This guy is low. You're thinking 2 things. Problem at 1 affecting 2, which you already know with N. Or problem at 2, 1 is fine. So how will I know? Check the difference. If the reason small a is low is because capital A is also low, the problem is at 1 affecting 2, my difference will remain what? Normal. So normal difference, A gradient supports what? This first theory. Something is wrong at 1, that's why 2 is low as well. So now you're gonna forget these guys. You see these boxes. Don't worry about perfusion, diffusion, the barrier, blah blah. I'm gonna go to what? To the respiratory system. Air coming in, ventilation. That's my concern. Atmosphere, FiO2, tidal volume, respiratory rate. That's what I'm looking at. Patient is breathing in low oxygen air. Patient is not even breathing in at all. Something wrong with their tidal volume, respiratory rate and stuff. They're hypoventilating. That's what I'm looking at for PaO2. That's why small AO2 is also low. But if I take the PaO2, small AO2 gradient, and it's actually increased, which means alveolar is normal, right? This is normal. This guy is low. That's why the difference is increased. Then what's the problem? The problem is at 2, not 1. 1 is fine. 2 is where the primary problem is. Now I'm thinking what? Cardiovascular respiratory interface, which is where barrier, perfusion, right? That's where the problem is. The barrier, diffusion barrier, or the perfusion. That's where the problem is. Not 1 is the interface. So this is why you want to understand it this way, just to make life easier. Respiratory comes first, then you have the respiratory cardiovascular interface, then we have blood, right? So 1, 2, 3, in that order. If something happens to 1, everything below that will be affected. 2 and 3 will be affected as well. If the problem is at 2, 3 will be affected, 1 will compensate, as well as hemoglobin concentration or saturation will be affected. But hemoglobin concentration will compensate. PaO2 will compensate by what? Hyperventilating or something like that, right? The problem is at 3, 1 and 2 will compensate. You start hyperventilating, right? Trying to compensate for the low oxygen saturation, hemoglobin saturation. Yeah, and the hemoglobin itself concentration might be high, depending, right? Or maybe it's anemia as well, depending on what is causing the problem at 3. Yeah. So if I give you a question where 2 is affected, PaO2, you're thinking 2 possibilities. Is the problem at PaO2 or the problem at 1? You can use what the AA gradient, determine that. So if the AA gradient is normal, which means both of them are low, the problem is at what? 1. I'm looking at respiratory system, air and the system. If the problem is at 2, because A gradient is wide, which means capital A is normal, I can get into the respiratory system normally. Okay, that's fine. It is the arterial that is low. Dissolved oxygen is low. The problem is where? Cardiorespiratory interface. CVS respiratory interface, barrier, blood flow, perfusion. That's what the problem is.